Hello and welcome to the two-man power trip of wrestling. I'm your host, JP John Poz. With me today, very special guest. You may know him as Skinner from the WWF. He's, of course, a multiple time tag team champion for the AWA Southern down there in Memphis, Tennessee, part of the Fabulous Ones. He is, of course, trainer to the stars, Mr. Steve Keirn. Steve, welcome back to the two-man power trip. How you doing?
Well, I'm glad to be back. Thanks for having me.
What is going on in your world? What's the latest?
Well, I've had a busy week this week. Being retired has not been what I thought it was going to be, but at the same time, when you span four generations in the wrestling business, that puts you in touch with a lot of different people. And this week, I had Ted DiBiase come down here, and he was doing an autograph session out there at the fairground. And he wanted to get together. Then he had a kidney stone attack, and then CM Punk came in to do a commentating for some cage fighting. And so Phil spent the night here, and I took him over to an alligator farm and let him get up close and personal with some alligators. And it's been kind of one thing after another. I did a special for Fox News here locally in Tampa promoting my book, and Natty and TJ let me use their gym. So I got out there and got to hang out with them for a little while. So it's been a busy week. I'm wondering, I got a couple of more podcasts coming up this week. So, it's not like I'm just sitting around, plus five
Right.
grandkids that are, I'm the big thing in their life because I didn't get to spend as much time with mine growing up, my kids. So I'm making up for it now.
Right.
But I got a 4-year-old that he just dominates me. So just staying busy, John.
I love it. Of course, you mentioned the book, which just came out, Keirn Chronicles Volume 1. So there's going to be more of the fabulous life of Steve Keirn. There it
There
is.
it
Yes,
is.
with my buddy Ian Douglas, who's a great author. He does awesome stuff. Tell us about
Yeah, Ian
Volume
Douglas
1.
also did this book right here, The Bohemian Rhapsody. I'm trying to line him up.
Oh yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's a good book too. Yeah, the
It's
history of
got Kevin
Bahamas wrestling.
Sullivan on the front. It's got Dusty on the front, Tyree Pride. I don't know who the other guy is, but when you worked here in the state of Florida, we'd wrestle in the Bahamas just maybe once every 3 months. And I know quite a bit about it because I'm a big water freak. I mean, I like to be underwater as much as on top of water. So with with Ian going into such in depth, history on the Bohemians down there, which is totally different audience than anybody's ever seen. They're just out of their minds, crazy for wrestling. So I mean, it was an interesting book. I actually wrote the foreword in that book for him. So but he's my author. He's the man. What a great writer the guy is, and very intelligent.
Yeah, he does great stuff. But how did your book come along? Because I know this is only Volume 1, but I mean, you got a lot of stories. How did this kind of come along?
You know what it is when we first started talking about it. My career was really unique so far as wrestling because it spanned 44 years. Most guys work maybe 20, 25 max. I actually wrestled 30 years, but not always full time toward the end. Some of it worked out to be indies. But then being in the office with WWE as an agent, then they later started calling us producers and then taking over the developmental and running that for about 6 years. It just extended my career in the business, but it also encompassed another generation of talent. So the book, when we sat down to write it, I said, I don't know how to condense 44 years and still make it a book that's not going to be like, Gone with the Wind. And he's going, well, we'll just play it by ear. And then he came up with the idea, let's do a 2-part book. Because this first book just takes us to 1987. And it kind of covers territorial days. And it talks about, the differences in the territories that I worked and the promoters and the talent and actually the audiences, fans and stuff, and how they accepted wrestling. So we're getting ready to go into the second one, and the second book will take us into those other ones where I started teaching more I started doing the agent thing, started controlling talent, actually promoted Dusty and myself and Gordon Soley and Mike Graham started PWF here one year, trying to revitalize Florida Championship Wrestling. And at that time, we went through a lot of training, and I started teaching guys even more in depth. I trained Diamond Dallas Page then, Mike Awesome, Dennis Knight, Joe Gomez. The list goes on, but we needed talent. So all we did was promote anybody wanting to learn wrestling, and I got flooded, and we ended up with some great talent out of it.
When you look at Volume 2, like you said, I mean, you got quite a career. I mean, Volume 2 is going to be just as good as Volume 1, right?
Well, I think it's going to be different, and I'll tell you why it's going to be a little different. And in Volume 1, it starts off talking about growing up, how I grew up with my dad being a prisoner in Vietnam, and at 13 years old, and Eddie Graham taking me under his wing. And my dad didn't come home till I was 21, so I kind of developed in my own man at that time and ended up in the wrestling business. But the second part, I mean, and then I went into the regionalized territories, and without a family name, you're just kind of like float around, and hopefully you'll do well, and sometimes you don't. But I was blessed that I kind of made a lot of friends in the wrestling business in the locker rooms and stuff. And then the second part of my life, which is going to be in the second book, it starts talking about an aging athlete. I mean, going from what do you do when you grow up? What do you do when you get old? And I had vowed in my life, because when I started, I wrestled guys old enough to be my grandpa. And I said, you know what? One thing I'm not going to do is I'm not going to be an old wrestler. I'm just going to walk away from it. And that's easier said than done, especially when you say that when you're young. And then when you get old and all of a sudden you're still feeding the family, you got to keep going. But, thankfully they came up with characters, and I didn't have to undress down to my underwear anymore. So I could go out there fully clothed like Skinner. And so I didn't have to worry as much about my appearance, but my work slowed down. I mean, I just got to the point where I was taking less bumps. I mean, I was more working than I was physical in there. And that's not what I liked. I mean, to me, I liked the aggressive work style of the NWA in the 70s and 80s. And so that's what I kind of wanted to stay in, that kind of a tune. But the business changed, so you got to change with it. You don't complain about it or critique it. You just roll with it. So I had to do that. So the second part goes through the aging and goes through the undetermined future and, not being able to save money. I remember one of the biggest lines old timers would tell you in the dressing rooms, hey, kid, save your summer money. I'd go, what money? I mean, you're making like $50, $60 a night in a lot of territories. There wasn't extra money to save if you had a wife and two kids. So I was always in the mystery of how you save money and stuff like that. But at the same time, it works out. But went through some dips. And I mean, I don't want to paint a bad picture, but I want to paint a truthful picture. So, young people that I've trained and young people that I've influenced, I mean, they don't know my entire life story. And so a lot of them have been curious and have enjoyed reading it. And they're going to enjoy reading the second half because there is pot of gold at the end. I mean, you either have like a success or a failure, but there is an opportunity that you can be successful. And when I measure success is not by how much money you have, is how happy you are and how at peace you are. So some of my friends that have tried to be so more wrapped up in making money seem to be the most miserable. And some of them, that lost all their money, they're still miserable, but they seem to have a little bit more peace. So I'm kind of in that middle. Anyway.
So you're kind of happy, kind of have money, basically.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many cliches. I mean, money doesn't make you happy. Well, first thing is If you'd have told me I'd make it to 71, I'd have told you that was never going to happen. Now I'm 71.
Yep.
Well, one of the things you learn as you get older is you get a certain sort of wisdom from experiences in your life. And you start realizing the things that really make you happy. I mean, my example is I tell people, says, well, when you're a kid and you get in your first car, you finally get your first car, you wash your car every day. You wax it once on the weekend. I mean, it's always clean inside. After you've had it a month, now you're washing it once a week. You never wax it. And then after a year, you're not washing it, you're driving it through a car wash. So you lose a sense of value for those things that you think you want so bad. But as you get older, you start realizing that your health, your happiness, your family, and all these other things are your real happiness. And because I'm a Christian and I'm a faithful follower of Jesus, that came into my life too. And it wasn't out of a crisis, it was out of a reality of wake up. I mean, we all know that we're all going to die one day and it's going to all be over. But a lot of people don't realize there's no U-Haul going to heaven. So what you store up is what you're worth. And if it's nothing more than love and friends and family and a good reputation,
You were saying you can't bring that U-Haul to heaven with you.
right? So it's just your differences in maturing and life's experiences. As your attitudes change, your perception in life of what's your goal and what you really makes you happy changes. And so I've gone through a lot of changes over my 71 years, especially. And then, I mean, I never had any animosity built up, and that's a sad thing for some of my friends that they watched the wrestling business make some major changes, and then they started getting mad at it and saying, "Oh, that's not what it used to be," or whatever. But they never accepted the fact that things change, and so I never had that same kind of like thought process. I guess because I was actively going through it at the same time it was making the changes. So I just accepted. I mean, you can't argue with the success of the wrestling business right now. So why would you say, it's not the same or it's not the business or whatever? It's just the way I describe it from my experience, because wrestling is just strictly an opinion. Everybody has an opinion on what they think it is and what they think it should be. And mine is it has changed from when it was territorial days to cable and worldwide, is that it's changed from, instead, we wrestled by emotion. We were told to go out and in 20 to 30 minutes every night, we were told to have a match that emotionally moved our audience, and we just ad-libbed. We knew the finish, but we didn't know anything else, and so we had to feel it out by what the audience was buying. Now, and they'll rehearse a match for 4 hours, for 6 minute match, and they just feed it to the audience whether they like it or not, because there's not a comparable to a whole lot of other choices. So it still works. It's just different. And instead of emotion from my era, it's movement. Now it's about movement. It's about, high risk movements, dangerous moves. I mean, there's no way I could ever make it now. I mean, I'm not very acrobatic. I mean, I'd have a hard time doing a somersault, more or less a moonsault. So
Right.
I wouldn't even be considered.
Do you watch a lot of current wrestling?
No, it's not anything personal. It's just that unless my students, I've got so many different students that are competing. If they call me and said, "Hey, coach, would you watch my match tonight? I'm on Raw and I'm working with so and so, and I'm a little uncomfortable with the match. See what you think. Give me a critique if you can, or just what's your opinion and whatever." And I mean, I'm encouraged, and I always encourage. I don't like people that knock stuff. It's easy to be an armchair quarterback and put stuff down, but it doesn't really do anything. All it does is just create some kind of like, you know, anxious feeling that you're not doing something right. But if you encourage and say, "Well, it wasn't so bad, I just maybe try to add something different." And I like to encourage them to watch old films, go into libraries and pull out some old wrestling films and find some guys that, you remember watching when you were a kid, and look at some of their matches and pull out some pieces from their matches and start incorporating it back in. It's all the same thing. It's just, just a different flavor and just a way to teach. And my best, results in teaching was telling them to pick 5 people, exactly, just to pick 5 people that they admire and pull just a little bit from each person. And then you got yourself. Don't try to carbon copy somebody. Don't try to be a duplicate of somebody because of their success. If you like something about him, take a little bit from them. If you like the way they moved, if they like the way they reacted, if you like the way they got fired up or emotional or promoed or whatever, try to incorporate some of that into your talented part of your business. And so if you can, if you do 5 different ones, you'll end up with yourself, and it won't be a carbon copy. So it'd be harder to actually put a finger on for people to say, "Well, I know where you got that." And used
Right.
to always have to tell them, say, "Don't go stand in the corner and raise your eyebrow up. Don't do that. That's going to be too easy to spot,
Yep.
But
Yep.
anyway,
And what's old is new again, right? When you really look at it.
well, it is. And it's the same business. When I started, I didn't invent the wrestling business. I started in 72. It had already been going a long time. So I just copied guys from the past.
Right.
And when I was learning from guys of the past. And that helped me educate myself into what was successful. How did they do? What looked good to me. I mean, you were really trying to take them on a roller coaster or a ride of good versus evil and get them emotionally involved. So what emotionally involved me when I watched them? And then I would try to utilize that way. Of course, that didn't work everywhere I went. I mean, sometimes the territory would change and it would be a dramatic transition. Going strictly NWA for about 10 years, and then all of a sudden going into Tennessee, it became more entertainment, and it took me a while to adapt to that. But you can't change the place you're at. You can only change yourself to fit into it. So that's what you had to do.
Who were some of the guys you liked when you started? Like when you're looking back at guys from 72 backwards.
Well, it was easy. I mean, my mentors were Jack Briscoe was the number one. I mean, he was a stud. He was, you know, just he had all the credentials. He looked great, but when he worked, everything was realistic and believable. And reality is, in our era, we were basically trying to take the audience into not a fantasy world, but trying to take them on a ride that made them have to figure out, is this real or is this fake? And when you could have it so controversial that they would come away going, "Well, I know it's supposed to be fake, but that one match, that was really good, man. Those guys looked like they really got mad. They really got into it." Well, Jack, Harley Race, Dory Funk, Terry Funk, these guys, I was surrounded by them my whole first part of my career. And I idolized them. And, they were just my stereotype and my pattern. And I was never one of them in particular, but I was them all together my whole career. And so that was just where my education was, but that was where I grew up, is in Florida. That's where it was more like that style.
Those guys are the best of the best too. Hey, you could go back and watch Briscoe versus Funk now, Jack Briscoe for Dory Funk, and it's still really good. I mean, they were awesome.
Well, they are, but if you take somebody young that's not, an avid fan of wrestling, that didn't study the industry and watch the business make its changes, it might not be what they like. It might be too slow for them. It might be too
Mm.
boring. I mean, because they get more intense. They take one body part. We were taught to take one body part per night. So if I was to wrestle you, I'd either work your arm, your leg, headlock, whatever it is, but I would continuously go back to it, go back to it, go back to it. And that was my main focus, was to break one body part down on you. And that also initiated a selling, that if I'm doing that to you, you had memory of what I had done to you. And so as we do something, and you may have a spurt where you'd come out of it, but you'd still go back to registering that shoulder, that arm, that leg. And it brought back the memory for the audience of, wow, his legs really hurt, or his arms really hurt. He's trying to break that guy down. So that was what it was about. But that might not be the thing for people to watch now, that don't see the differences in those time periods.
Yeah, it's a different day and age, and the brain cells, if you will, are different. Them watching stuff is way different now than it used to be. It's the TikTok age of watching stuff. Oh, 30 seconds, attention span, things like that too. It's a lot different nowadays.
Well, there's so much to compare to too. I mean, I'll give you an example. Tampa, here where I grew up. Um, I went to high school with 5 guys that are in the wrestling business their whole lives. But we were all wrestling fans because there really wasn't anything. There was no Tampa Bay Rays. There was no Tampa Bay Buccaneers. There was no Lightning. Um, there was no professional sports. It was just wrestling every Tuesday night at the Armory. And then Saturday, we were on Saturday night at 7 o'clock. The opposition to that, there was only 3 television stations, and the only opposition to wrestling was Hee Haw. And then on Sunday, it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and the only opposition to that was Meet the Press. So we dominated. Then plus, we were identified because we had personalities that came across, with Gordon Soley as the announcer. And so we were bigger in life when we went anywhere we went. I mean, we stuck out. Everybody's, at least 6 foot, 200 and something pounds. So that wasn't average back then. That was a pretty good sized guy. So you kind of stuck out. And without being, oh, that must be a football player, or that must be, whatever, a hockey player. We didn't have any comparables. So it was the only game in town. And the same with, the viewing. Nowadays, I mean, me personally, I get probably 500 or 600 television stations, and at night sometimes I can sit there and just keep flicking the channel, can't find nothing interesting to watch. I mean,
Yep.
there's just so much to offer. As everything's flooded, so you could be a wrestling fan for a year now, and then find some other interest, some other show, and just lose your interest or your chain of thought and move on. So it's not the same, but it is. The business is the same. It's still, designed to entertain people and to get them. Years ago, and I'm going to tell you something that I learned when I was young, but years ago, wrestling was actually prescribed by psychiatrists. And the reason it was because it would let an inner release of your emotions go. You could go to the wrestling matches, sit in the audience, and get mad at the bad guy or the referee and cuss him out, scream at him and yell at him and blow your whole emotional, thing off of your chest. And they say it would take the replace of their boss, their wife, whoever that was, they couldn't do that to. They could go do it and release it at wrestling. So it was actually a therapy. I mean, that's not, it wasn't prescribed, but at the same time,
Right. Right.
doctors would tell you, say, hey, man, wrestling was a great therapy for patients I had that were just all tight, wound too tight, or dominated by their bosses or jobs or whatever. So it was a release, an emotional release. So I don't think it's that way now because it's not a reoccurring thing every week. I mean, here in Florida, we wrestled 7 nights a week, 8 times a week because we'd tape TV on Wednesday and then drive to Miami. But we were in the same city 52 times a year. So every week you're back to that same city. And so you had to be different. And so that was a regimen. And it just now, the major companies will come through the cities maybe once or twice a year. So actually the live shows are a little bit less. I mean, there's plenty of television, but the live shows and stuff like that are a little bit less.
When you go back, right, to the 70s, and I gotta get your take on this, if it's even true or not, because I heard it from a bunch of people. So you go through the 70s, you said you started in basically 72, but around 78, when that year comes around, there's a rumor that the WWWF is looking, and Vince McMahon Sr. is looking to Eddie Graham and saying, I want to build my next All-American boy, my next champion. I'm gonna go past Bruno, we're gonna go to Superstar Billy Graham, and then we're gonna go to the next guy. The rumor was it was going to be Bob Backlund, who it ended up being for 5 years, or it was going to be
Right.
Steve Keirn. Is that
Mm-hmm.
actually true? Were you actually going to be the WWF World Heavyweight Champion instead of Bob Backlund?
Yes, that's true. But the stories that are surround it are always a little bit different.
Right.
And I don't know if we'll ever really know the true story. And here's the reason why. It was because promoters talking between themselves, Eddie Graham, Vince Sr., back and forth, trying to switch out talent, who's would be the perfect fit, and then being selfish too. Okay, should I give up my top guy to make this guy over here more money that I don't get a part of? Or should I give him somebody else and keep my top guy? And so, Kevin Sullivan is a real close friend of mine, and we talk quite a bit. And he was around at the same time, and he told me one side of the story, but then Dusty told me another side of the story. And then, of course, Eddie's dead and Dusty's passed, and so I never really got the true story, or maybe I did, but it's mixed up with about 4 or 5 different stories. So when the story's told, it's kind of a mystery. They sent Bobby down here from Minneapolis, and I was doing really well. But the only reason I was doing well is because that I was working against great workers, Bob Roop, Bob Orton Jr. I mean, the list was unbelievable. More talent came through Florida because it was a paradise. Don Morocco. I mean, they just kept feeding us really good guys. But when you're working with those kind of guys, you just get better and better. And when Bobby came, he was a really nice guy. He had a great credentials as a shooter and amateur background, but he was very mechanical. He was like, I don't know how to say it. It's not an insult, but he had no fluid motion. He was locked out. He was like a robot kind of. And they put him with me as a tag team partner, hoping that maybe some of me would rub off on him. And it's not saying that I was so great that he needed to rub off on me. It was just that I was different. And hopefully, when you're within a tag situation, that's when you learn a lot of things. Because if your partner is just a little different than you, you're going to pick up some of his traits just by watching him standing on that corner. And so they were trying to loosen Bobby up. Now, I don't know if that was a prerequisite for him to go on to the WWF or whatever it was. But, I was a part of taking a world title belt and dropping it in Japan that Vince Sr. sent me to Fujinami. And when I spoke to Vince Sr., he actually said to me, well, if you do me this favor, I had planned on bringing you up here and really doing a lot with you. Now, that that could have meant anything. It could have meant, just giving me good matches or payoffs or whatever. But I always thought it was meant that was what the position he wanted me to come up and do when I came back from Japan. But when I came back from Japan, I really didn't want to go to New York. And this is the reason why. It wasn't that I didn't want the opportunity to be their world champion. It was I was afraid of the cities. I was afraid of large cities and trying to find my way around and trying to, get a lifestyle and live it. And I mean, Boston and Philly and, Detroit and New York and all of those cities to me were so overwhelming. I had the opportunity. I went and worked the gardens a couple of times with Dusty. They flew us up there, and I was scared to death. I was scared to death. I couldn't imagine being in a car and going, well, who am I going to ask? How do you get to Madison Square Gardens? I mean, pull over. There's no 7-Elevens. And so when Eddie told me, he says, hey, listen, kid, they changed their mind. You're going to stay here with us, and we're going to put the moon on you. Well, they did. I mean, him and Dusty was the booker, Eddie was the owner, and they all of a sudden, one day I'm the Florida heavyweight champion, I'm the brass knuck champion, I'm the television champion, and I'm one half of the United States tag team champions. So they hung belts all over me and gave me great opportunities, and I was happy. I was home. I mean, one of my close friends, Arn Anderson, that I was an agent with and a producer with, he used to say, if Steve Keirn doesn't see a palm tree when he lands, he's miserable. And if he sees snow, he's ready to go home. And that was when I was an agent. And I said, yeah, you're right, Arn. It's really hard when you've grown up and your whole thing is based around being outdoors and, you're dealing with the water and the fish and everything you deal with. And it's all taken away from you. And now you're just living inside your house because it's too cold to go out, or there's not anything you want to do where you're living, so you just kind of become a hermit. So the story about me being taken into New York is a true story, but who knows what the real truth about it was. I mean, Kevin Sullivan says it was like a bet that Vince couldn't get Bobby Backlund over, and Eddie was the one that promoted me because Vince at that time, I'm talking about Vince Sr. too, by the way, I should say that, but
Yep.
They're talking at that time nationalities, and they had the Sheik up there. They had guys from, different countries, but I was the perfect prototype for the All-American boy because my dad had been a prisoner of war in 2 wars. I mean, I was a flag waving All-American easy, and I had an angle here with Bob Roop, and we did really well. And so I was a proven person that could put people in seats and follow the lead, but it wasn't just me. Nobody really draws and is successful without an opponent, without a promotion, without everything else that goes along with it. So I had made a test run on being able to actually support things if they gave me an opportunity. And Bobby hadn't. And so Vince was wanting to get a shooter too, because he was worried about his talent not cooperating. If you're cooperating, then basically they'll go along with it. But if they don't like somebody and they want to make them look bad out there and they can't take care of themselves in the ring, sometimes you can be taken advantage of. Well, I'm not a shooter, but I always considered myself smart. I mean, when somebody's taking advantage of me, I would outsmart them in the ring. It wouldn't be a fight. It would be, okay, so what can I do to figure this out and outsmart them? So that's the way it worked out. But Bobby would be able to back it up by being able to stretch him. So that was the difference.
And with that Bob Roop thing, a lot of people say because Donald Trump is such a big wrestling fan, and he knows a lot about wrestling and the history of wrestling. He was a huge fan, that he possibly took your angle with Bob Roop and turned it when he was making fun of John McCain. oh, I like guys that don't get captured. I like winning soldiers. Like a lot of people think that. I don't know if you've ever heard that or think that's true or not, but it's funny that's come up from a bunch of people that think that's where Trump kind of got that verbiage from.
Well, that's funny because now it's just kind of like those scenarios it could have been, would have been, should have been, and all that. But I mean, I've my whole life has kind of like been changed by the last maybe 10 years of watching television and media and things like that. I've gotten to the point where I almost don't believe anything.
Yeah.
I'm almost to the point where I don't know who's right, who's wrong, what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong. First of all, I don't do their jobs. Second of all, I don't know who's telling me the truth anymore. It's almost like my business, and when you can sit back and you look at the whole big picture and you're going, damn, this is wrestling's got written all over this. I mean,
Yes.
we've created so many different situations of hatred, and I mean, people grouping together in different things and topics and stuff that gives other people an opportunity to point a finger and all these things. And to me, it's just somebody's sitting there just stirring the pot. They're just stirring the pot, stirring the pot. And it causes controversy and it causes people to be interested in following. But who's right? Who's wrong? You know, I never had to worry about that. I mean, at least I didn't think I did. I mean, I never, in my lifetime, it was just always kind of like, okay, well, this guy's the president, that guy's not. This guy's doing this, that guy's not. This guy's got money. I was always told that, if you had a lot of money, you would never be in trouble. But I never had that kind of money. So
Right.
I always worried about getting in trouble.
Yeah. When you look at you, like you mentioned, you like to be outside, you like Florida, you like the weather. And it's funny, you like look at okay, the fabulous ones, right? I mean, you look like $1,000,000, you and Stan Lane, you're on top of the world. But then when you go to WWF,
There he is.
yes, yes, there you go. But then when you
There
go
you
to
go.
WWF, it's funny, you become the Skinner. And then I'm like, but I was like, "Why is that a rib? Like, why is he like the Skinner?" And then you read and you learn about you and stuff. It's like you like that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? The alligators and stuff. So is the Skinner more to you real life, or is the fabulous ones more to you real life?
Skinner, but not that guy.
Hmm.
Skinner was when Vince Jr. actually when the transition to characters came about, and I had Jimmy Hart help me out getting up in there. When I went there, I had just killed 15 alligators on the first hunt allowed in the state of Florida. They had been on an endangered species list. Matter of fact, you can probably see this one on the wall behind me.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Oh yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So I killed 15 alligators. And when I went to see Vince, I was really kind of confused. Nobody in the dressing room that were my friends had wrestling tights on anymore, except for Hulkster. And so everybody was a character. So I figured if I'm going to go up there, I better do something smart and come up with some ideas of my own. So they don't have to just create something around me. No telling what they'd create around me if I did that. So I was a little leery. So I walked into his office and I laid down the alligator hides, some skulls, a couple of paws, some teeth and stuff, and said, well, I don't know if this would help you anything, but I just killed 15 alligators in the first hunt in the state of Florida. And, I know all about that kind of stuff. And, if like you can incorporate that. And he just told me, he looked at me, goes, okay, well, I'll go home. Anyway, go home and let your hair grow out natural. I had bleach blonde hair. He said, go out brown hair and let your beard grow long. I had a short beard for a fabulous one kind of look. And in a month, come back and I'll have you a character. And when I came back, they had an art rendering of Skinner. And when Vince first said to me, he says, well, Steve, did you see the movie Deliverance? And I'm going, yeah, I saw it. And he goes, well, I want you to be one of those guys. Well, going from fabulous one, I'm thinking he's talking about Burt Reynolds. So I go, oh, you want me to be Burt Reynolds? And he goes, no. I want you to be one of the guys in the woods with Ned Beatty that says, hey, boy, you got a right pretty mouth. So, I mean, here's the thing, and this is not making any excuses for Skinner or whatever, but the character was depicted to me, and I played the part. I mean, was that Steve Keirn wrestling? No, that was Skinner. You got to excuse me. I'm taking radiation right now. I have throat cancer.
Oh, wow. Sorry to hear that. Oh, man.
Well, no, it's not a bad thing, and I don't want any sympathy because I have to take 30 sessions of it, and I had to take it, and it's kind of makes my throat a little itchy, and I hate to keep coughing. I don't want you to think I'm just coughing because I got COVID or something, but it makes it kind of difficult sometimes to carry on long conversations. But when I was doing Skinner, the first time I worked up there, I worked like Steve Keirn. And the first thing Vince did was pull me aside when I came back from the ring, and he said, what was that? And I said, what do you mean? That was a wrestling match. And he goes, no, what was that? What were you doing out there? He said, you made more moves than Bret Hart. And I said, yeah, well, that's my style. He said, well, you're depicted as an alligator poacher out of the Everglades. How did you learn all that? Know your role. And so I retarded my wrestling. I mean, I pulled everything back, and I just went to limited movement and less input and more, just kind of a brawling kind of a scenario. And I probably lost a little connection with my actual character and my persona at that point. But, you're just trying to figure things out. When things are changing, you don't just automatically get it. It takes a while. And so Skinner came out of the bat. I mean, I never wrestled in my clothes. I sure as hell never wrestled in combat boots. I mean, so everything was different to me. And so I made the changes and stuff like that. But, for whatever it's worth, you're only as good as your promotion makes you. I mean, you're the same in wrestling as you are as a movie star. Tom Cruise wasn't a movie star until they gave him the right parts and kept continuously giving him that. I mean, even The Rock, I've known The Rock since he was a little kid. I was friends with his dad. And he wasn't a big superstar when he was a little kid. It was time and promotions and, progressively pushing him and giving him the right opportunities. And he's done a fantastic job of doing and fulfilling those things. But not everybody gets those same opportunities. So you just take what you can get, because at bottom line, the whole thing boils down to you're getting paid. I'm getting paid to do this. You're getting paid to do that. People said, well, you never won a title when you were a Skinner. And I go, okay, yeah. You think that was my choice? If I'd have been the booker, I'd have beat everybody the first week I was in there and had every title. But I wasn't. I'm an employee. I'm working for somebody. If I'm going to be a champion, they're going to make me a champion. If I'm going to be a superstar, they're going to make me a superstar. I had the ability to do it, but you have to have the input to do that. So other than that, you just do your job. You do what you're told and you get paid. And there's no hard feelings. You just do what you're told and how to do it. And you be happy that you're working. And that's the way I always looked at the business. I just happy to have a job. Wasn't that, I was thinking I was better than anything or anybody. It was just that I was capable of doing something if you gave me an opportunity. But if you don't, I'm happy with it. And I'm just glad to get a check. And I put 2 kids through college and fed my family. And that was that was my goal, and I succeeded. So sometimes fans can be brutal. One minute they're telling you that they know everything. The next minute they say, well, how come you didn't ever do this? And how come you never did that? I go, wait a minute. It's not your choice. You don't get those choices. And sometimes it's political. Sometimes it's a family member. Sometimes it's a friend of somebody. Sometimes they just like you better than they like somebody else. And so they give them those opportunities. But one thing, and when I teach too, and I've taught more than anybody's ever taught, I teach them, don't ever compare yourself to nobody when you get in this business. Don't get into business and sit in that locker room and look around and say, man, I'm better looking than that guy. I got bigger muscles than that guy. I'm more of an attraction than that guy. Accept what you got and do the best to fulfill it and just get along, because it's a job.
And if you think about it, when their fans are going, "Oh well, Skinner never won a title," or "Skinner didn't do this," you have action figures, the Hasbro's, like that lives on forever. So there's certain things where it's like you didn't do this, but then you live on literally forever in the history of the business because people are obsessed with these action figures and they want Skinner Hasbro, and then you're going to sign it for them, and you know what I mean? You live on forever because of things like that.
Well, I think that my grandkids are the only ones at their school that their grandpa's got 3 different action figures.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Yeah, because when I was blessed with an action figure at the very, very first ones. Stan and I were in the AWA, and then Remco came out and gave us action figures in. I was like a little kid. I went to Toys R Us and saw my own action figure in Toys R Us, and I bought them all. The guy, when I put them on the counter, the guy looks at me and goes, "Oh, you a big wrestling fan?" I go, "No, hell no, that's me." And he looked at the action figure and he looked at me and goes, "No way." And I go, "I'm telling you, that's me." And he goes, "No way." I pulled my driver's license out and showed the guy my driver's license in Minneapolis and said, "Hey, man, look at my name. Look at my driver's license. That's me, dude." And they go, "Wow, they made you look good." I go, "Yeah, I want to buy them all." So, yeah, and I kept everything. I've kept every wrestling magazine or every program or everything that I was ever printed in and put it away for my children, grandchildren later on. Matter of fact, I'll tell you something that I started, and it was just out of just a coincidence, but Mike Graham had a daughter here that still lives here in Tampa, and it's his only surviving child. We had a son and a daughter, but his son committed suicide. Mike committed suicide. His dad committed suicide. Their grandfather committed suicide. So Nicole's the only one left. And Nicole turns to me like an uncle figure more and says, "Steve, what do I do with all this stuff that my dad and my grandfather left?" They got programs in Japan. They got magazines. And I said, "Nicole, did they sign anything? Did they just put their signature on anything?" Well, she looked through everything. She couldn't find any signatures. And she finally said, "No." And I said, "Well, the way collectors are, it'd be more valuable if they had signed stuff. I mean, but when you have stuff of your own, you don't think about signing it.
Right.
But if you read, when you read my book, if you see pictures of me in a book and it's signed, it's because a light went off in my head, which I spread around all of my friends and said, sign all your stuff. If you have stuff you've collected, pull it out and sign it. Put it back in and let it stay. Because if you pass away, and we all will, it's going to be more valuable to the people you leave behind to sell it if they need the money or whatever they want to do with it, if it's signed. And so I've signed everything I have. And I mean, so that's why people go, "Why'd you sign your pictures in your book?" And I said, "Well, it's kind of a long story, but sorry, I just told it to you, but that's what it was."
Yeah.
And
Makes sense. Yeah.
it was just another one of those things that you'd never think of doing that, but it makes sense after you think. When I told Ron Simmons at an autograph session about it, because he was a great football player star too, he looked at me like, "Well, that's a smart thing to do." He said, "I could pull out my FSU stuff and sign it, and I could pull out my jersey." And I said, "Absolutely." And so, a lot of my friends are signing their own things and putting them back in, storage or wherever they keep them, and taking my advice. But it was just me giving advice to somebody else, and I started thinking, well, wait a minute, I'm giving all this advice and I don't have anything signed. I mean, it took me 10 days. I had to take everything that I ever was a part of, and I was a part of a lot of things. So when I sat down, I just kept signing, putting it away, new box, new new container, whatever, sign. And then I started realizing I even had wrestling magazines that I wasn't even in. And I'm wondering, what would I do? What was I doing with these? Because that I had boxes of magazines. And then so each one that I would sign, I'd have to go through it and find the story that I was in, why I bought the magazine to sign. And anyway, then I had to go through these magazines. I went all the way through this magazine and there was nothing in there about me. And I'm going, why did I buy this magazine?
Right, right. Yeah.
But I divided them up that way too. So I put the ones that I didn't have any personal relationship with over in another container. And still have it. I'm not sure what I'll do with it, but it always becomes, useful somewhere down the line.
Anything in the business that you regret looking back? Anything you wish you would have done that you didn't get the chance?
No. That's a question that comes up quite a bit, but I don't have any regrets. I mean, I don't have any things that I would change. I wouldn't go back through and change my life. I think it was a blessing in a way that my life went the way it did because my ego never got out of shape. I mean, ego actually stands for edging God out and replacing him with you. And I've been blessed to realize how thankful I am to have done the things I've done and how blessed I was to have survived and how blessed I was to be, healthy as I am. I mean, I've had my hips replaced and several orthopedic surgeries, but I've got friends on canes. I got friends on walkers. I've got friends that are going through dementia and Alzheimer's and all these things that are ring injury responsible. And I turn around and say, well, wow, you can walk and talk and chew gum at the same time. You're doing really good, Steve.
Right.
So count your blessings, Don't go back and say, well, I wish I'd have done this or I wish I'd have done that, because the only one that'll ever bother is me. I'm at peace. I'm totally at peace, John. I mean, if if I had the opportunity to change my career, the only thing I would have changed was I made more money, but that would have been to give some more away, because money is not an answer to happiness, just like I said. So, I see some people that I'm associated with and around that can't let go of the business. They can't turn it loose. They're still trying to look like their characters, or they're trying to get one more match, or they're trying to do these things that I'm going. It's just sad to me. Once you're done, you should be done. And here's what I think you should do, and what I've tried to do in my life is share every bit of my experience and my lessons that I learned in my business with young people. I'm surrounded by some of the most talented young people. I mean, like a CM Punk stayed here with me, and he wanted to talk about things that, you just don't normally talk about in a locker room. And I wanted to share some of my thoughts with them, and Drew McIntyre talks to me all the time. And these young people are so hungry for just life's experience, and there's no way to get better in the business except for experience. And when somebody spent 44 years of their life doing it, even if it's not the same thing as when I did it, some of the things like psychology are going to fit in. And here's one of the most important that I share, and it's dressing room. Fans and people that watch wrestling from the outside don't really see this part, but they think it's all about competition in the ring and all of that. It's not. It's how well you're accepted in that locker room. How well are you accepted in that locker room as a good person, a nice guy, willing to do anything for anybody else and not be selfish? Because that's when you're really building your legend. Your legend is based on what kind of a person you were, but it wasn't in the ring. That's your persona. Your legend is how were you in the ring? How were you in that locker room? Did you get along with everybody? Did you have enemies, or did everybody just like you? I learned to be that guy that everybody liked. If they said, hey, Steve, we're going to have to beat you tonight, I go, sure, no problem. Who is it? Somebody? Okay, fine. What can I do to make them look good tonight? And when they hear that, they're automatically pleased that they're not struggling with somebody that's jealous or not wanting to do it or not cooperative. They're all of a sudden going, well, he's a good guy. But there's a secret to not being a shooter. I wasn't a shooter. In other words, I wasn't a great amateur wrestler and fighter before I started in the wrestling business. So there's a lot of tough guys in the business. But the toughest guys in the wrestling business are my closest friends. So I would, anybody that started kind of getting a little irritated with me, I say, hey, listen, no offense, I'm not tough, but my best friend, if you mess with me, might not like that.
Yes.
So I kept, I mean, Andre was my closest buddy when I first started because I was like a little kid around him. But if you messed with me, Andre would get mad at him. And when I was young, a lot of guys messed with me. But Andre straightened out a few in my life. Later on, it was Haku, Jody Simon, the great Malenko's son. It was different guys, but the ones that knew, the dressing room and the locker room guys knew. I said, well, Kern's not that tough, but his friends are tough.
Don't mess with them. Yeah, that's awesome. Yep. And guys, obviously not to be messed with. But as we wind it down here, we head towards the finish. Just give us one last push for the book and where everybody can find the book.
Okay, the book is for sale on Amazon. It's the Kern Chronicles. I'm trying to get a good picture of it.
Yep, perfect.
And I'm also carrying them to me with some autograph sessions. I've got some appearances coming up. Don't forget the Bohemian Rhapsody, also by Ian. But I'm carrying them, and this is all a new experience to me. I've never sold anything. When I do these signings and I do virtual signings or I do conventions and stuff like that, I've got one coming up next week on May 5th. May 5th in New Jersey. I'll be up there for a guy named Scott Wilder. And he said, well, if you'd like to sell some of your books while you're here, be more than welcome to do that. And so he gave me an opportunity to bring some book and sell them. But when I sell them live and stuff like that, it gives people an opportunity for me to sign it.
Yep.
I'm not charging an arm and a leg for people to buy my book signed because I think it's a compliment for them to buy my book, first of all. And it's my first chance to have some kind of communication with the wrestling fan world. And okay, well, I might not have been the guy that you wish would have wrote a book, but at the same time, I spent a lot of time in the business. And so if you compliment me by buying it, I'd be more than happy to autograph. So that's going to be a plus. The books that sell on Amazon aren't autographed, and so that's the only difference. But the only place right now really to buy it is on Amazon.
All right, Mr. Keirn, great stuff. Of course, Keirn Chronicles Volume 1, The Fabulous Life of Steve Keirn is available, like you said, now on Amazon. Thank you so much for all the time. Really appreciate it.
All right, John. Well, thank you for having me on.